at this point, maybe I should say, welcome to the presser, Ms. Nalunga. Our second speaker is Ms. Shenai Mukumba, Executive Director of the Tax Justice Network Africa, TJNA. TJNA is a research and advocacy organization with a robust network of civil society organizations with the united effort of leading tax justice voices across the continent. It's based in Nairobi, or its secretariat at least is in Nairobi. And Shenai has a master's in international relations from Wits University in Johannesburg, and is currently studying for a master's in taxation at the University of Oxford. As I said, well, she's a TGNA, of course. She's based in Nairobi and provides provides strategic leadership and direction to deliver on TGNA's mission and vision in its various thematic areas. Welcome to our presser, Ms. Mukumba. And then, last but not least, ladies first, of course, but last but not least, Mr. Jason Rosario Braganza, a Kenyan economist, but also the executive director of the Africa Forum and Network on Debt and Development, AfroDAD. AfroDAD. His work focuses on his work over the past decade has focused on trade and regional integration, finance for development and tax, illicit financial flows, and domestic resource mobilization, poverty, and inequality. As I said, Mr. Braganza is the director of the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, AfroDAD. Those will be our speakers for today. I shall introduce them as we go along to speak on their various sessions. But first, I have to say that the objective of this press conference, webinar press conference, is to raise awareness about the ongoing debate on the need to reform the international financial and economic architecture. It does not take a rocket scientist to know that this architecture, or the way the international finance and economic system is designed, favors what we call the global north over the global south. I don't like to use the word, but developed countries against the least developed countries. Some people even say never to be developed countries given the architecture. And we want to raise awareness about this. It's an ongoing debate. It's been an ongoing debate forever. We want to raise awareness about this, and we're hoping our speakers will unpack it for us and increase our appreciation of the subject and what needs to be done, and probably even our own individual roles in hopefully helping to reform this global financial and economic architecture. So without much ado, I want to call, I was going to say it's a virtual thing, I want to call to the floor, but this is virtual, so I'll just say, I want to ask Ms. Jane Nalunga to set us off with her discussion on the historical perspective with a specific focus on multilateral trading system and challenges surrounding it. So, Ms. Nalunga, the microphone is yours.
There is a call, that these institutions have to be reformed. Some people are talking about a reform, other people are talking about a transformation. We'll come to that. So, but it's also broadly around the reform, the entire reform of the global governance. And today we see there are conferences, the Financing for Development Conference, we'll talk about that later. There's a Summit for the Future. In the World Trade Organizations, we have had a number of calls to reform the World Trade Organization, to reform the agreements, and to reform the entire institution. There is a saying that you don't change a winning team. The team, the global institution, the team is not winning. And why isn't it winning? Because what we see today globally, we are looking at a lot of inequality. In fact, we have gone from looking at poverty to looking at inequality. The poor are really poor, then the rich are rich. So we are looking at inequality between countries and also among countries. We are looking at the commodification of services. If you don't have money, you don't access health services, you don't access education, water. You know, we see also climate change. There are climate issues, and climate is also related to our nature of production and our nature of consumption. So the things are not working on so many fronts, and there is a need to reform, to rethink global governance. Maybe before I look at specifically what needs to be done when we talk about the reforming of the global trade architecture, I need to point out that this isn't the first time that countries are calling for a rethink and a reform of the global financial architecture and economic architecture. Around the 1970s, there was a very serious call to reform the global system under the NAM, the non-aligned movement. Those were the pushers. Then the G77, then UNCTAD also. They put on table that we need to reform the global system, which isn't working for the people. And those changes didn't materialize. In fact, those calls ended into the Reagan and Thatcher putting on table alternatives of market-driven economies. And I think some of you have heard of the Washington Consensus. So when we talk about the global governance, it has also passed through changes. But what we are saying that today, the system is not working. And I want to give some examples on when it comes to the issue of the economy, the issue of the trade. As you know, most South African countries, we are integrated in the global trading system as exporters of raw commodities. We export coffee, we export cocoa, cotton, tea. They are largely raw commodities with very, very minimal value addition. When we add value, we put tea in the tea bags, you know, we send sometimes the coffee beans. So that value addition is very, very minimal, very low processing and very low value addition. And this is what we are exporting to developed countries, especially the advanced economies. And in return, we are importing value-added products. You know, what we have, all these technologies, you know, with the cars, everything, you know, which is value-added. Most of it, we are getting it from industrialized country. So this very, very unequal exchange has led to what we see today. Our economies are poor. We have very chronic trade deficit. In fact, most all African countries have a trade deficit. A trade deficit is where your exports and imports are not balancing. Then we have problems of balance of payment problems because of that. We have externalization of our capital, and this has also led to the cycles of indebtedness we see, because the ends are not meeting, you know. So we have to get resources from outside to be able to invest in our countries. So the international trade system, which is managed by the World Trade Organization, the WTO, has worsened this problem of commodity dependence. And when we look at also the structure adjustment programs of IMF, World Bank, they have also they have also entrenched this integration, because IMF, World Bank has told us, liberalize. If you want loans, liberalize your economy, open up. They tell us privatize, and we have sold off almost of our government enterprises to the private sector, you know. So when we open up, that means products which are more competitively produced flood our markets, and we can't, our industries can't compete. And that's why you see in most African countries there is what we call deindustrialization. You know, we have deindustrialized, you know, we don't have any industries to talk about, you know, because of those that WTO and the IMF, World Bank telling us to open up. So when you look at that, even the bilateral investment treaties, bilateral trade treaties, bilateral investment treaties we are negotiating, they are locking us, you know, they are locking us and reinforcing this integration into the global economy. All the bilateral investment treaties we are signing, they reinforce that. I want to give you an example when it comes to a trade agreement which is reinforcing our commodity dependence. Some of you have heard of the Economic Partnership Agreement. Economic Partnership Agreement, which African countries are signing or negotiating with the European Union. That agreement, the Economic Partnership Agreement, the European Union was negotiating it with its former colonies in Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific. So now, as Africa, they decided that we'll be negotiating the Economic Partnership Agreements between EU and regions, ECOWAS, SADC, East Africa. The East African community, we started negotiating. And basically, this agreement is telling us to liberalize our trade with the European Union. Imagine a country like Uganda will liberalize 86% of our trade with the European Union. European Union is an advanced economy and they provide subsidies, but they wanted us to liberalize. East African community refused, said, this is too much liberalization. But now today, Kenya has signed that agreement, the Economic Partnership Agreement. And apart from telling us to liberalize, they are telling us don't put export taxes. What are export taxes? Export taxes is when you tax exports. For example, if you are producing cotton, if you want to discourage the export of raw cotton, what do? You put taxes on it. And you say, if you add value to your cotton here internally, we won't tax you. You can export clothes. European Union said, no, don't put any taxes. So those are some of the imbalances within the agreements we are we are saying. But Kenya, because of a carrot and stick, you know, our partners in the north, in those developed countries, use a carrot and stick to make us sign some of these agreements Kenya has signed. Another example which I want to give is on the investment regime. One issue which we need also to understand in the global dynamics is the rise of the multinational companies. When we talk about multinational companies, we talk about companies like the petroleum companies, the Shell, you know, the pharmaceutical companies. They are all over, they are global, and they are searching for profits at all costs. And their governments, European Union, we sign agreement on behalf of their multinational companies. So when you look at the investment, the global investment regime today, it's imbalanced. It gives rights, all rights to the investors without any obligations. And there are no rights for governments, there are no rights for the environment. So they are really, really imbalanced. Look at I'll talk about our investment regime in Uganda. And it's the same, apart from South Africa. South Africa is the only country in Africa which changed its investment regime. But most of our investment regime in Africa, largely we are allowing investors to come in, go where they want, do what they want, and we give them incentives. Now we have formed economic processing zones, you know, where we put them like they are in palaces. They don't pay taxes, we give them land, we give them sometimes free electricity. They do what they want. We don't tell them provide jobs, no. Then they take out what they want, all of it. Because in our investment regime, we say you can transfer all your money. And they transfer the money in hard currency, not the local currency they work in. Now, even in the global investment regime, there is what we call the ISDS. The ISDS is where companies can be able to take our governments to court. And when they take governments to court, they are taking them over. Let me give you an example. If a government, like now we are in the issue of climate change, if government tells a company that you, instead of dumping your waste in Lake Victoria, we have put a law in place so that you can be able to process your waste in a more environmentally friendly way. A multinational company or an investor has a right to take government to court because that's appropriation. You are reducing their profit by telling them to process their waste in a certain way, you know. So those are all the issues we see happening because of the nature of the global trading system, the global investment system in place, you know. And we need to talk about also the linkage, because when we talk about investment, when we talk about trade, all those imbalances are reinforced by the imbalances which you will hear in the financial system, in the debt architecture, you know. So it's like a system working together against us, you know. And that's why when we talk about systemic issues, we are talking about breaking down, you know, breaking that system. In the WTO today, I don't know how many minutes I have, Paul. So please let me know when I go overboard. In the WTO today, there is an agreement they want to put in place called the Investment Facilitation Agreement for Development. And that Investment Facilitation Agreement for Development, it's not for development, it's for the multinational companies to get more profits from our countries. So we need also to address that. We need to fight. They also, how many minutes? 10. There is also the competition policy. What I want to say is that when you look at the multilateral trading system, developed countries are bringing on board policies which are good for them, but not good for us. Today, there is no competition policy, competition agreement, because a competition agreement, the competition agreement which they wanted to put on table in the World Trade Organization was talking about leveling the field, compete, so that, for example, Tyson can be able to fight it out to his Herbert there. Herbert, those who can see him, he's very small and slender, But for them, they are telling us, level the field for companies to compete. That's what they are saying in the WTO when it comes to a competition agreement, And we are saying, no, that can't work, So what I want to show you is the iniquities and the unbalanced agreements in the WTO, in the global trading system. Today, in the WTO, our governments have fought really hard. There is no competition agreement in the WTO. I want also to give you another example of the government procurement. There is an agreement on government procurement, which again developed countries wanted to put on the table. Why is government procurement important? For any country, even if it's as poor as, I won't say poor countries, we are all poor countries. Even if a country is poor, it has resources to be able to procure services and goods and infrastructure. Even if they are borrowing, government has money, whether it's borrowed money or money is generated internally, isn't it? So now what developed countries wanted to do for their multinationals to partake of those government procurement contracts is to be able to have an agreement in the WTO that when government wants to procure, to build a road from Kampala to northern Uganda to Arua, you put it, be transparent, put it on the table, let companies compete. Let Starlink in Germany or where compete with our local private sector. Again, countries said no, developing countries said no. They said what we want from our government procurement is to be able to grow our private sector. Because if you give a contract to your private sector, you can be able to grow that private sector, your local private sector. Again, this issue of government procurement is on the table. So what I want to show you, the fact that the global trading system is tilted against us, and we need to be aware of what's going on. We need the press, the first estate, to be able to understand these global dynamics and be able to put these issues in the public domain. But what I also want to tell you is that it's a contested space, because everything, what we are talking about, the economy, we are talking about trade, we are talking about investment, we are talking about finances, we are talking about debt, all these things, we are talking about money, and big money. So it's contested, you know. And what we need to be aware of is that nobody owes us a living. We need to fight for everything we get. We hear, and especially you, the press, the First Estate, the way you report, somebody is helping us. The European Union has helped us. The World Bank is supporting us. That reporting is not good. How many minutes? 3. That reporting is not good. What we want to tell you today is that the space is contested. It's a fight, and it's a fight for our own livelihood, our own dignity. Another last issue which I want to point out is that we have a number of strategies at our respective national level. We have the national development plans, we have them. We have our regional strategies. For example, we have now the Continental Free Trade Area. We have it, you know. We have the Lagos Plan of Action, which is talking about structural transformation, that we need to structurally transform our economies. Structural transformation means, because you see another issue on the table, what developed countries are telling us. They are telling us diversify your economies, industrialize and diversify. What I want to say, diversification, what they are telling us, from producing coffee, add on tea, add on cocoa, add on palm oil. That is not diversification, because we are going to still remain as exporters of raw commodities. Another issue, they are telling us to industrialize. Industrialization is okay, we want to industrialize, but how do we do it? That's where structural transformation comes in. Because today, the model of industrialization we have is the EPZ, the industrial parks, you know, where we have industrial parks everywhere. They are islands unrelated to, their islands out there. They are not related to our economy. What we want is structural transformation, where we link the industry to agriculture. So you link industry, agriculture to industry, industry to services, then you are exporting value-added products. That's what we call structural transformation. But in order to have that, we need policies at national, regional, and Africa level, but we need also the global architecture to make sure that that global architecture support our structural transformation. And this is why we are here, you know, to get the support of the press, the First Estate, to understand that and be able to report that. In Siatini, we have a saying that you don't get what you deserve. You know, sometimes you hear people say, you know, we are poor, you know, we should be helped, you know, we are poor, our people are poor, but you get what you negotiate and what you fight for. I think I will stop here. Thank you so much.
So, Ms. Pumba, you can take over, please. I'll give you 20 minutes. So it's 10:56, by about 11:60. Yeah. Cool.
Okay, thanks. I just want to confirm that the colleagues that are in Uganda can hear me. Is that okay?
Yes, yes.
Perfect, thank you. Good morning, everybody. A huge thank you to CIT, both for the invitation and for organizing this. It really is such a timely and important conversation that we're having right now. And Jane, thank you so much for opening up this discussion for us and setting the context for where we currently are, the history, as well as some of the different initiatives that are currently taking place in order to reform the local financial and economic architecture. Before I begin, I agree with you, Paul, that indeed we are finding ourselves in quite a bleak situation, and I think Jane did indeed reflect various dynamics that are at present. Having said that, in terms of, sorry, it's here. In terms of the current initiatives that are taking place in order to reform or transform, I think more accurately, as Jane put it, the global financial architecture, it's actually an incredibly exciting period right now. I think we find ourselves at a very unique time where there are various initiatives that are taking place across the various streams of the global financial architecture to really overhaul it. And so, first of all, a huge thank you, Jane, for inviting some of us that are doing work in different spaces, right, in order to meet the very same objective. Right now, as I'm talking to you, I'm in New York, so it's 3 a.m. Early in the morning. But I wanted to participate in this because, like I said, it's a very important conversation. But secondly, the reason I'm in New York is because right now there is a discussion that's taking place in New York to reform the global tax system. So there are a number of similarities that we see across the various streams, right? We're trying to, first and foremost, democratize the way decision-making happens, right? Within the trade space, within the debt space, within the tax space. And right now, as I'm in New York, there are various African governments that are pushing to reform this global tax system. So for those of you that may not follow the conversation very closely, which is for the first time ever, conversations that are happening at the UN, where every single country is at the table and able to contribute to this decision-making. The status quo currently is that global tax rulemaking is currently undertaken in Paris, whereby the OECD is the institution that oversees that, but only really comprises of just over 30 Western countries. And so really dating back to the 1920s, 1940s, as Jane indicated, developing countries had been pushing for this reform in order to have much more of a voice in global tax rulemaking. And we're now seeing that come to light, and it's really, really exciting to see that momentum. And then I think on my part, to be able to contribute in a sense to the discussions that are taking place. The reason this is so important is because at present, when you think about the rules that govern the international financial architecture, there is a bias towards the countries that were in the room when these rules were being discussed. So specifically for the global tax rulemaking space, when the rules were being developed in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, many African countries specifically were still colonies, right? We at that time were fighting for our own independence from the very same countries that were in another room developing these rules, right? And so, as you can imagine, because we weren't in the room, the rules that currently govern the global tax system are biased and are skewed, right? Towards global North countries, towards Western countries. And so because of that, we find ourselves operating within an ecosystem that isn't cognizant, right, of our needs, our priorities, and our capacities. And in a sense, subsequently then constrains us, right? So the question I was asked to speak to was how is the global financial architecture affecting or impacting our domestic resource mobilization efforts, right? First and foremost, because of the skew, right, we ourselves are not able to subsequently and efficiently tax a number of the multinational corporations that are operating within our countries, right? Many of these multinational corporations are in our countries in order to take advantage of many of the resources that we have, right? And unfortunately, because of some of these rules, it really disadvantages us and puts us on the back foot, enabling us, right, in order to ensure or to increase domestic resource mobilization in that sense. Secondly, and this was something that Jane also spoke to in her remarks, the current global financial architecture that we have also has found a way to keep us locked into participating in the sort of global value chain at the lower end, right? Whereby we are exporting low value commodities and find ourselves importing higher value commodities and find ourselves within this trade deficit. We have a global financial architecture that doesn't enable us, right, to use our taxes in order to adjust for that, right? So that we're able to find ourselves participating at the higher end of value chains, right? And so those are some of the things that currently constrain us, that are some of the reason we need to be having this conversation today. The third issue that is really important when, again, talking about domestic resource mobilization and the global financial architecture is this issue of us not being able to maintain within our borders a lot of the revenue that we generate, right? So for those of you who have worked with us at TJNA, you'll know that one of the things that most preoccupies us, our time, is how to limit the loss of revenue that is leaving our continent as illicit financial flows, right? So as a continent, early in the mid 2000s, it was indicated that we were losing close to $50 billion annually, right? And so ever since then, there have been a number of initiatives that have been put in place to help us address that, right? I mentioned earlier that because of where these initiatives were being situated ourselves, we're not able to effectively participate in that. And so subsequently, what we've actually seen is an increase in the amount of resources that we're losing as a continent, an amount that's almost doubled to now $90 billion. What this means is that we are losing resources that we need to sufficiently channel into key areas within our economy, right? Into our education sector, into our infrastructure sector, and even into our trade and development space, right? It's important, therefore, that we are at the table and participating in conversations about reform of the global financial architecture, so that we're able to have a system that enables us to maintain within our borders resources that are being generated through activities that are happening within our economies, right? But also, we need to participate within this global level conversation, because when, for example, these resources are leaving our continent, they're finding a home in other countries, right? Which means that there are certain loopholes that currently exist within our ecosystem, right? That enable some of these countries to receive and then subsequently hide these resources. So right now, the conversation about the reform of the global financial architecture is really to help us address those things, right? Firstly, how do we democratize decision-making at the global level, right? Because as I mentioned, we weren't at the table and subsequently the rules are not in our favor, right? So that we can equal the playing field. I think it's important to note that when we are asking for this reform, when we are asking for this change, we're not asking for anything other than equality, right? Which is something that we don't have. That's number one. The second thing is we're asking to be able to put in place a system that fosters what we are already doing at national level, right? I mentioned am in New York right now and listening to the negotiations. I remember in the first session, when African countries were saying it's important that we have this conversation, many developed countries were saying, but we are providing a lot of capacity building already in your countries, right? There's already so much technical assistance that we're giving to African countries. And the pushback was, listen, even if we have the most efficient domestic institutions, unless we have a global system that is supportive of what's currently happening at the national level, it really isn't going to serve its purpose. So, for example, we may have the most efficient, say, revenue authorities, but if the global tax rules say that you're not able to tax a multinational corporation that's, say, taking advantage of some of your mineral resources, there's no amount of capacity building that's going to help you address that, right? So what we're trying to do here, like I mentioned, is address these rules that are essentially not enabling us, right, to take advantage of our own resources and skewed away from us. And then, of course, like I said, thirdly, we need to have this conversation because as a continent, we are incredibly wealthy, yet we have some of the highest levels of poverty because a lot of these resources are finding themselves out of our continent. And so we don't have what we need in order to sufficiently address the questions of poverty and inequality. And the reason all of this is important is because it's supposed to, if we're able to address these issues, it's supposed to help us achieve, as Jane mentioned right at the beginning, a structural transformation agenda, right? We need to find ways to strengthen our economies. We need to find ways in order for our economies to go from those that are only participating, as I mentioned, at the lower end of value chains, of the value chain, to a much higher end of the value chain. All of this are all of what I've just said are aspirations that are indicated in our Agenda 2030, right? In order for us to be able to see an Africa, right, that all of us that is able to support our developmental objectives. This conversation also finds its importance in the sense that as Africans, we have identified within Agenda 2030 that we need to increasingly become dependent on ourselves, right? And less dependent on external financing, right? Less dependent on debt and overseas development, etc. And so this conversation is really to help us do that. And the reason for this is because if we're able to generate resources domestically, we are therefore able to be the ones that are in charge of where these resources are going, right? And put it into the priority areas that we see as most important. Unfortunately, at times when we receive funding from externally, we are then often informed where we need to put that money, right? And our investment, so to speak, is less directed by the needs of citizens in terms of, you know, where we want to prioritize those resources. So really at the end of the day, this question of domestic resource mobilization is tied, I think, ultimately also to the question of sovereignty, right? To the question of autonomy. This question of the global financial architecture is also to help us, in a sense, to play a key role, right, in directing our own developmental agenda. I think as I conclude, what I also want to say is that the question of the global financial architecture is important to support the national level reforms that we also need to take. I know often when we're having these conversations as media, the question is almost always, yes, there's all of these things that need to happen at the global level, but what about at the national level? There are issues that we need to address at the national level. I completely agree, right? But I think it's important to take note that in order for us to meet our developmental objectives, we need to have a multi-pronged approach, right? Absolutely, there are reforms, there are changes that we need to take at a national level. There are ways in which we need to hold our office bearers to account, right? And
this is a lot of the work that we find ourselves doing often. But over and above that, we also need to be concerned about the global financial architecture, right? As I've mentioned, even if we were to completely address the issues at the national level, all of that is undermined unless we're able to address the issues at the global level. And so the point of this conversation, as journalists and as media in the room, is also draw your attention, right, to the conversations that are at the global level. I know some of you may have been involved or taken part of, for example, the Panama Leaks, right? Those kind of initiatives that were really able to draw attention to some of the loopholes that exist at the international level. So really hoping that this conversation can really give you a little bit of a platform to start thinking about those broader ecosystem type questions that unless we address, also undermine a lot of the work that we are trying to do as African people on the continent. So Paul, I'm going to wrap up there and then happy to answer any questions that you may have at the end.
Thank you, Shanae. I thought you kind of took me out of my deep funk after Jane's talk, but then I think you took me right back in. But we shall discuss that during the question and answer session. One question that pops to my mind is, what's our leverage in all these things? It's all very nice to turn up in New York or Geneva or what, but what's our leverage in getting what we want? But that's probably a question you're going to address in the question and answer session. But thank you very much for that, Shanae. I'm moving on to our next speaker, Mr. Jason Rosario, who is Executive Director of African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, AfroDAD, and is going to is going to tell us more about how the global financial economic system is making our indebtedness, Africa, even worse. Well, this session is getting bleaker and bleaker. But anyway, Mr. Braganza, the mic is yours now.
Thank you very much, Paul, and good morning to everybody, and a very, very early good morning to Chennai, that's New York. Let me begin by, first of all, thanking Siatini Tax Justice Network Africa, the Stop the Bleeding campaign, for putting this together at a very important time, and especially coming hot off the heels of so many exciting things. And hopefully, Paul, some of the things that I'm about to say may take you out of your funk. So I think the broad question about why do we need to reform the global economic architecture, I'll bring us back to the continent just to illustrate why we need to do some of these things. We have 4 countries that have defaulted on their debts: Zambia, Ghana, Ethiopia, Chad, and there's a few others that are not too far the edge of default, including my very own country in Kenya, where I'm joining you from. Number 2, we have seen a whole bunch of public protests that have taken foothold across the continent. Again, in Kenya, in Uganda, where we're having the center, and more broadly speaking, across developing countries in Argentina, in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and so on. And when one looks at this perspective, the question that we need to ask ourselves is, what is facilitating or motivating people to get onto the streets and demand changes, demand more accountability and transparency from their leaders? It's because the ecosystem that our countries are functioning in are not serving the interests of citizens, but rather, as Jane and Chennai have mentioned, are serving the interests of a very few countries and even a fewer number of multinational corporations that seem to be able to siphon billions of dollars out of the continent and the global south more generally every year, and without being held to account, but at the same time continuing to exacerbate indebtedness, inequality, poverty, lack to public services, and so on. And why is this important in the context of debt? Well, 3 points here. I think number one, the point that Jane has mentioned around, you may have hear her mention things around trade deficits, balance of payments deficits. You've heard Chennai mention issues around illicit financial flows, taxation rules, and so on. What all of these combine to do at the national level on the continent is to create a broader, what we call fiscal gap or budget gap. And this creates a fertile ground for governments having to borrow in order to plug those gaps. So our inability to trade high value goods or to move up, higher up the value and supply chain in terms of manufacturing and industry leads to a gap that we need to plug through attracting foreign direct investment. Our inability to raise domestic revenues through taxation forces us to have to give tax incentives for foreign direct investment to come in. And that creates a fertile ground for us to have to borrow. Now, borrowing, you'll hear a lot of people talk about borrowing not being bad. It just depends how it's managed, how it's used, and so on and so forth. But in the current context, the borrowing that many African countries are doing is actually very, very bad. Because a lot of it is being used to run government operations rather than investment and development. A lot of the borrowing that's being done is being used to service existing debts. And this is creating a very vicious cycle of dependency of borrowing to run government and pay debt, as opposed to invest in development and invest in citizens. And so it locks us in this very difficult position. A lot of that is perpetuated by the issues that both Chennai and Jane have raised, but also underpinned by the governance structure around how international debt is managed and governed. So primarily, this is now done by the International Monetary Fund, whose job is to ensure macroeconomic stability, but at the same time, it also acts as an insurance policy guarantor for creditors. And so what it does is it provides a line of credit to developing countries on the continent so that developing countries can continue going to international capital markets to access commercial debt in order to fund their government operations. And so we're in this vicious cycle, because when it comes to then having to restructure or reschedule our debt, we are caught in this very difficult place. So this is another problem around the debt governance structure. The third point is that we need not to look at debt as an individual item. And I think these are some of the lessons that we've learned from the 2000s when we had the HIPC debt cancellation period. Again, another point in time where people often refer to say, we had debt cancellation, yet we're back in the same situation. Why do, what needs to change? And I think the biggest thing here is that we cannot isolate debt in terms of the broader set of development finance instruments. They all have to work in tandem. Debt needs to be targeted. You need to have the right type of instrument, and you need to finance the right types of projects. At the moment, you have a mismatch or a misalignment between the type of debt instruments that our governments are using to finance long-term projects. Some of these instruments are very short-term, and therefore, even before the projects are completed in terms of their construction, the debts are already coming due. And that's why you're having this situation. So over and above all of that, what are the kind of things that we need to think about? And if we're going to try and get a better reformed global economic system, an economic architecture that is fairer, is more just, and addresses the debt issue from the perspective of a borrower and not necessarily from the lender. Well, one of them has been mentioned, and this is about how do we ensure borrowing countries, and particularly African governments, have a same singular powerful voice at the negotiating table. Because debt, just like tax, just like trade, is a set of negotiations. You want to borrow, you negotiate the type and terms and conditions of the contract. If you are struggling to pay, you negotiate the restructuring, rescheduling, and so on. So we need a level playing field. We need a transparent playing field where borrowers are able to sit down together with their lenders and hash out a deal. At present, this is not happening. We have a system that predominantly favors creditor coordination. This is the common framework that I'm referring to, but it does not allow borrowers to come together, negotiate as a whole, as a team in a coherent and coordinated way. So what we are asking and what we are proposing is that we should have a similar process that to that Chennai has described with the tax work and the tax rules, to have a similar process under the auspices of the United Nations, where developing countries and developed countries and creditors can all sit on the table as equals and negotiate in a fairer, transparent way and give, the benefit of the doubt to the borrowing country in order for it to not only meet its development objectives, but at the same time also meet its debt servicing obligations. But more importantly, there has to be a give and take. And at the continental level, African ministers of finance have for a very long time called for a review of the existing debt relief and debt restructuring processes that are in play. They've actually asked that some of these are not working, and we're seeing real life examples of this in the case of Zambia. We're certainly likely to see similar durations in terms of length, complexities, in terms of difficult creditors when the time comes for Ghana to enter its full restructuring negotiations. And we're certainly going to see this when Ethiopia starts negotiating its common framework restructuring program as well. And I think what is very fundamental here and why we're asking for a proposal and a process under the auspices of the United Nations is that it still remains the space where developing countries, especially from Africa, can wield a significant amount of power and influence without due stress that is currently put on them when they are negotiating in other spaces, particularly through the common framework, particularly through the G20, through the IMF, and so on and so forth. And more importantly, and I want to echo this very much of both what Chennai and Jane have said, this is an issue of sovereignty. Right now, the saddles of debt are impinging on the sovereignty of our countries. It's impinging on the sovereignty of our citizens. And so whilst I do not want to dampen further your mood, Paul, it is important that we look at this architecture in a way that is progressive and enhances the voice of African countries and African citizens on the negotiating table. At the national level, of course, and on debt issues, we should not run away from the complexities that are at national level. There are issues of transparency, accountability, and governance on how debt is utilized. And I think as we try and set up a global system that is fairer and just at the country level, it's important that at the national level, we have equally robust systems that do not jeopardize the sovereignty and the rights of citizens when countries are deciding to take on debt. And certainly, as I mentioned when I began, the protests that we're seeing across the continent, in part, they are because of the level of indebtedness. It's because of the amount of borrowing that governments are doing. At the national level, borrowing is a deferred tax, because at some point in the future, the government is going to use taxation to raise revenues in order to pay that debt. And so, members of the fourth estate need to be very much alive to these dimensions. It's important for us to fully understand also how the mechanics of debt works at the national level, the roles of different ministries, departments, and agencies within the governance system that hold government account when borrowing is being done. And so here the role of parliament becomes very important. The role of the judiciary becomes very important. The role of the media becomes extremely important in ensuring that the executive and the government bureaucracy is held into account when governments are borrowing. And finally, as I wrap up, I think it's that interconnectedness between national, continental, and global remains extremely important if there is going to be a coherent position. And what are the opportunities in the next 1 year, 1.5 years that lie ahead of us? So The process that Chennai is currently involved in stemmed and started way back. Well, it's founded in a report from 2002, but the actual process started in 2015. This is through the United Nations Financing for Development process, which gives us the roadmap of how development finance is defined, how it's governed, and how it's generated and distributed towards meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. So the fourth conference is taking place next year in Spain, and the process towards developing that roadmap started in Addis Ababa a few weeks ago. And with regards to debt, the group of African countries that Chennai has mentioned who are also doing tax on debt have asked for a global legal debt framework under the auspices of the United Nations. So that is a huge opportunity for us at the international level to support the African member states to develop the components of what that framework might look like, to develop the components of what a process of negotiations might look like under the United Nations, and to ensure that that is secured in the outcome document in Spain next year. So that's one huge opportunity at the global level. At the continental level, the African Union has within it, through the Abuja Treaty, the provisions and the instruments to set up and establish African Union financial institutions, such as the African Central Bank, the African Monetary Fund, the African Monetary Institute, the African Investment Bank, and so on. These are important levers of negotiation. When Jane and Chennai talk about trade and finance and the cost of accessing this finance from the international market, having our own institutions to be able to negotiate on behalf of the continent is going to be a huge game changer. So at the continental level, supporting the processes to establish these institutions is extremely important. So the Fourth Estate has an important role here in asking their governments, there's this thing called the Abuja Treaty. Have you ratified it? Have you deposited the instruments back to the African Union Commission? Can we understand what progress is being made? And these negotiations and these discussions are currently ongoing. So it is extremely important at the continental level that we come together and support this African Union process in getting us through the door, in setting up our own levers and of negotiation and strategy and coherent positions. At the national level, there's an important role to connect what is happening at the continental and global levels with our national level. So are we adjusting, for example, our domestic legislation to adapt to the changing landscape of our creditors? Many of our African governments are doing domestic borrowing, are borrowing from new bilateral lenders like China, like India, like countries from the Middle East, Russia, and so on. They have a different way of doing business. It's not a wrong way, it's not a right way, it's just different. But our laws adaptable enough to doing business with them. We have a lot more commercial creditors through different Exim banks, for example. We have Eurobonds and all types of different color bonds to deal with education, climate, gender, and so on. But our domestic policies in place to help safeguard us from situations where we're not able to pay back those bonds, or we need to restructure them? Do we have dispute resolution mechanisms in them? We are currently experiencing the existential threat of climate emergency and energy transition. Do we have negotiation tactics in case we have climatic emergencies that can help us suspend our debt service while we recover from these climatic emergencies or COVID-19 type pandemics? So there are lots of these things that at the global level will also fit at the continental and national level. And as we think about reforming the global architecture, these are the things that we need to consider. These are the opportunities. I think, I like to look at the protests that are taking place, as I conclude, that are taking place across the global south in particular, as an opportunity. It's not to put Paul in a deeper funk, but to say that people are finally realizing that the system is not working for them. It's working for a few elites, and that can no longer be the order of a state of play that we operate in, because people's lives are at risk. People's lives and livelihoods are endangered of being affected by the kinds of decisions and the kind of system that we work in. So I think I'll stop there, and thank you very much once again for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Jason. It's been interesting for me, this question of or the discussion by Jane, Chennai, and yourself. Of course, Jane started by saying that the world is increasingly being integrated, but it's to our disadvantage, as can we call it, the global South and Africa in particular, our own countries in particular. And this has had adverse effects on our taxation, on our resource capacity to build resources, mobilize resources, our trade situation, and of course, eventually our capacity to improve the livelihoods of our people. Chennai also said a lot of the same. I liked, not that I liked, but my attention was drawn to one point where she says that the global system is being used to keep us at the bottom of global value chains. But she put a smile on my face when she talked about we need to be more self-reliant, rely on our own resources, which is a pet subject of mine. Just today, for information of the meeting, just today, our local mobile telephone company, MTN, reported that in the last half, 69 trillion shillings moved through their system, about $18 billion. Whereas these are just transactions, but I can imagine when MTN was not around, where was this 18 billion? What was it doing? So we've got the capacity, if we can just aggregate some of these resources, to really make meaningful difference at home. So, and then Jason also talked about debt, of course, the debt situation. And I was particularly disturbed, of course, by his saying that whereas debt is good, our current loans are used to just finance government operations and to service existing debt, locking us in some vicious cycle that again is not in favor of our citizens. He was, however, hopeful that the increasing moves to locally, regionally, internationally to negotiate these things, to negotiate improvements in the global financial architecture. So we're going to a question and answer session. It's now 11:34. I think we shall do about 20 minutes of this. I think we shall do it. I think the journalists are in the room there. So somebody hopefully is taking the microphone around. But let me start the question by just asking, and I think it of course goes to the three presenters. I asked it already, but I can ask it again. What is our leverage in trying to negotiate an improvement in this global financial infrastructure, basically to make it more in our favor or to balance it more towards ourselves? What leverage do we have?
Paul,
maybe Chennai, you want to go
first?
Oh. Let Chennai go first.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first, Paul. So for me, I think that's a really good question, because I think it betrays a mindset that some of us have, right? That should even be a question. And the reason I say that is because we are a continent of such wealth, right? It's actually the very reason we had colonialists coming here in the first place, right? We are rich in mineral resources. We had this incredible temperature. And I mean, I mentioned mineral resources, but I mean, over and above that, right? Just our climate, etc. So our leverage really is just that, right? That we are the site of wealth on in the world. And even when you think about the conversation that's happening now, right, about you know, where can we get the resources that are required to help us navigate this transition we need to go through as a global economy, right? All of the strategic minerals, not all of them, but a significant amount of the strategic minerals are found here on the continent, right? And so when you ask what is our leverage, that's the very thing. The reason I was talking about mindset as I was asking this question is because I think we forget, right, as a continent, that we have this leverage, right? That this is actually what we hold when we enter into conversations. We're not actually on the back foot, right? We have what the rest of the world needs. And I think if we take that mindset into all negotiations, right, whether it's a discussion on reform of the global tax system or reform of the global debt system, right, recognizing our position, our true position, I think, within the global economy, that'll take us a long way in helping us have outcomes that are in our favor. So when you ask what is our leverage, I would say we have all the leverage. It's just how to use that leverage in a way that most benefits us, that we need to start thinking, I think, more deeply about. I hope that answers your question, Paul.
Oh, well, I don't want to bog down the discussion, but a good start. Jen, you want to say something?
I can add on to, thank you so much, Chennai, and thanks for the good work you are doing in New York. And thanks, Jason, also for your points, very great points you have made. When we talk about our leverage, in addition to what Chennai has said, I think a number of countries, especially developing countries, which are unhappy with the current system, we have the numbers. We are many, taken up just Africa, many countries. So when we talk about developing countries, we are many, and we can be able to push, as Chennai has said, it's the way, it's the how. Another point, which is really important, is the fact that despite the fact that the system is not working for developing countries and poor countries, but it's not also working for some people in developed countries. Taking an example of what Chennai is working on, the issues of tax, the issues of illicit financial flows and tax havens, even developed countries are suffering from that. The multinationals are also taking resources away from their governments and hiding them in tax havens. So in a way, the system, there are people who are seeing that the system is maybe working for multinational companies, that it's not working for the people, and it's also not working for the planet. So we have a number of leverage points which we can be able to use to push for the transformation of this current system. Thank you.
The resources that Chennai and Shane referred to, and also the young mobile population that we have, I think politically we are at the cusp of something very great. The work that's being done on the UN Framework Convention on Tax is the brainchild of an African political initiative that was spearheaded and chaired by the former South African President, His Excellency Thabo Mbeki. It is through his work and his attempts to define very comprehensively the issue of illicit financial flows, being beyond just corruption, illegal to tax related, that has put us where we are today with regard to the negotiations. If you look at how the negotiations got there, the African group of countries united, and through a voting process, this is through the United Nations, were able to outmaneuver other countries that were particularly developed countries, the G7 in particular, outmaneuver them just through a democratic voting process. And this is why we continue to say that the United Nations is the place where, if we want a fairer, just, democratic system, it needs to be within the United Nations, because then Africa can flex its muscles because through its voting and through its coordination. Secondly, if you look at, in the early 2000s, when we had the debt movement and the debt campaigns, a lot of these were being spearheaded by African countries and African leaders who appreciated and again understood that the burden of debt, because of the failure of structural adjustment programs of the 80s and 90s, the failure to reach a comprehensive trade negotiation agreement, and Jane has talked about that, landed us in a very difficult position. So a lot of these have come from the continent. And I come back again to more domestically, the protests that we're seeing across the continent are that is going to be a huge amount of leverage that young people, progressive politicians, progressive policymakers are going to have against our governments. If you look at the kind of decisions that our political elite are having to take right now. So we do have a lot of leverage outside of the resources, the young population, but also politically, there's a lot of leverage that we have out there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason. So I mean, I like that. I mean, the chances, you can have all the wealth in the world, but if it's not aggregated, your negotiation position really doesn't do anything for it. But yeah, so we have the resources, and now we're having the beginnings, or can you say the maturing of a political will to speak together to get things moving. I also have been informed that a lot of our journalists are online, so you can send your questions through online over the chat that's attached to this webinar. But I have one question already from Luke Anami from the Nation Media Group in Nairobi. He asks that Africa is negotiating for a United Nations Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. At what stage are the negotiations in terms of timeframes and gains, I imagine, in progress? I don't know who would like to start with that, if it's actually a thing.
Yeah, I can speak to that. Sorry,
Oh,
I'm just
okay.
reading the question. It says, at what stage are the negotiations in terms of timeframes and gains? Okay, so hi Luke. Right now, the negotiators are discussing the terms of reference for what is going to be this UN Framework Convention on International Tax. So what they're currently discussing is what should be the primary elements of focus for the Framework Convention. They're discussing how long should it take to decide on the Framework Convention, and also what are some of the protocols that they want to start looking at now. So the protocols are going to be the elements of the convention that focus on specific tax issues, right? So one of the topics that's currently being discussed is taxation of the globalized economy, right? Or taxation of digital services, illicit financial flows. So that's currently what they're discussing right now. This year, there's been 3 different meetings called sessions, where every single government has been asked to send delegates to sit in a room to think through this. Over and above those meetings, there's been a smaller group of countries known as the Bureau that's then been collating all of those discussions to then sort of churn out draft documents. The reason I'm saying that, Luke, is because within the Bureau, there's 4 African countries that sit in there, and Kenya is one of them. The other 3 are Ghana, Morocco, and Egypt. Egypt is the country that's currently chairing this entire process, and doing a remarkable job, even if I do say so myself. So that's where the current discussions are. So next year we will actually begin negotiating the framework convention. They're currently discussing the time frame, but we are hopeful that within the next 2.5 years or so, we will now have a final convention that countries can sign on to, and protocols that countries have negotiated that can actually start to see us addressing, like I mentioned, this imbalance that we currently have in the global tax system.
Okay, seems like very long time frames. Would it be safe to say that beneficiaries of the status quo are not just going to lie down and roll back the benefits they have enjoyed for so long, and therefore these extended timelines?
Well, no, I mean, I think to answer your second question, they're absolutely not going to roll over as this process unfolds, right? Because you know, what we are really asking for, right, is an evening out of what's been an unfair and skewed and biased system. And so what that requires is a certain taking away of power, right, in order to give it to those that have been deprived. And so, as you can imagine, if you were in the position of that power, right, to give it up is not an easy thing. So even in these negotiators, there's been a lot of pushback, right? And so because of that, there's a need to double down as African countries to support what's happening, right? And part of the reason I was so keen to participate in this virtual presser is because we need the media to start covering that more. I think we need the media to start showcasing how Africa is pushing back through this process against an unfair and unequal system. There's not enough people that know that at citizen level, but also not all of the ministries of finance and foreign affairs are as engaged as they should be. And part of what's going to help us do that is by processes like this, right? And just an increased coverage. So you are right. They're not taking it lying down. They're sending, some countries are really sending high-level delegates in order to negotiate. We need to do the same thing, just to be able to even out those conversations.
Okay, thank you, Shanae. I've got a question from a journalist in the room. Could you please give us your name and then media house and question or comment?
All right, thank you very much. My name is Ismail Ladu. Nation Media Group Uganda, and two quick questions. One is a follow-up on what Paul asked earlier on leverage. I need your quick thoughts on how about coming up with an alternative, say a continental financial system that is made up of either countries from the global south or just entirely African countries. Then the others will simply plug into this financial system rather than us plugging into their system. Just your quick thoughts on whether that is something that is viable. Then, to what extent are groupings such as the G7, the G20, and even the OECD countries standing in the way of reforms that we are discussing this morning? Just a bit of, is that something they are buying into it, or from what I'm gathering, they are standing in the way? And how can that be countered? Your thoughts on that? Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. Okay. I think it's a very good question. And again, I think I'll start with the high level panel on illicit financial flows as a very important starting point of us trying to have our own things. Of course, it's not the only one. There were many before that, and many that have come after that. But I use that as the starting point because of where it has led to with regard to the theme of this press conference, which is reforming the global economic architecture. And of course, I'll also recall or take us back to the period of COVID-19 when three big things happened, right? Number one, the finance ministers from the African Union member states were very quick to call for an effective and deliberate debt relief package because the debt service suspension initiative that was presented was not good enough. It was too short term, and by the time it was going to have any real impact, it had expired. And so they needed, something that was a bit more medium to long term, something that was a bit more structural. And so, there were calls at that point, even the African Union did appoint a special envoy. I believe it is Dr. Donald Kaberuka, the former president of the African Development Bank, as the special envoy to advise on the economic recovery post-COVID-19. So one of the things we need to do is revive that commission and revive his docket with him, sort of because we've not recovered from COVID-19. Indeed, we've actually continued to experience more shocks with the energy shocks that we've experienced as a result of geopolitical tensions in Europe. There's also been food shocks as a result of the same tensions. So we need to revive those types of high-level working groups that advise at presidential level, in terms of what the recovery should look like. The third thing is related to how during COVID-19 we saw very clearly the inequities of the international system, and I bring two examples to mind. Number one, when the Republic of South Africa requested for a waiver on the intellectual property rights for the production of vaccines to be allowed to produce and store vaccines in South Africa, the Global North refused and rejected that at the WTO on the grounds that they felt that the pharmaceutical companies would lose out. There was no way of compensating them for the research that they had the money they had invested in the research to come up with the COVID-19. Now, bear this in mind that this was an issue of matter of life or death. The Republic of South Africa was asking for this waiver because it had the capacity and the capability to do the production of the vaccine in Africa and distribute it throughout the continent. And this was flagrantly disregarded by the international community, particularly those big pharmaceutical companies in the global north. Just to illustrate why then we need to come back and support the establishment of our own African institutions to be able to negotiate better deals for us and actually invest in having our own homegrown continental solutions. The second one is to do with the International Monetary Fund's issuance of special drawing rights in 2021. It's considered the largest ever issuance of this this standard currency that all countries who are members of the IMF have access to. It amounted to about $650 billion US equivalent. Now, the way the IMF is set up, it's based on your contributions to the IMF, so sort of like subscriptions, which gives you a quota and a right. Now, because African countries have lower contributions proportionally, the entire continent, 55 African countries, out of that $650 billion, only received $33 billion. So again, just to show and illustrate why the system is not working for the continent and why it is very important for us to come and take a step back and challenge the existing framework by developing our own alternative models, by establishing and creating our own African institutions that can help deliver the kind of transformative finance that we're looking for. The G20 that has been referred to, yes, the African Union is now a fully fledged member of the African Union, but we still need to remember that the United Nations is the most fairest place where Africa's voice is heard and can actually change things. And so we must not be distracted by the fact that we have this membership. It's a membership that we can leverage in terms of understanding where geopolitics and global policy direction is, and then take that to the United Nations for it to be standardized and governed through an equal voice, single vote type of process. So we need to be also be very pragmatic with these different processes that we're involved in, and understand where our biggest wins can come from. And at present, it is the United Nations and not these other processes where we are finding ourselves distracted and having to invest a lot of resource with very little return for our pennies that we're putting in there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. So the beginnings of trying to create an alternative institutions, or at least some critical mass to improve our negotiation in the global financial framework is a viable thing. However, you say that the existing structures like the UN, which we can leverage to, to get our way or to get our foot in the door, I think. Shana, you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree with Jason. I think like he mentioned, there's interventions that we need to make at national level, at regional level, and at the global level, right? So of course, right now we're talking about the global level, and I think we've spoken to that, but there is also work that we need to do at the regional level, and of course, all of this work under the auspices of the Africa Union, but over and above that, through the regional economic communities as well, right? So I know specifically within the tech space, I think it was 2 years ago that we saw the development of a tech strategy and an IFF strategy. Interestingly, the development of these two strategies was as a result of seeing that discussions that were being led by the OECD to sort of start to answer some of these emerging questions in the tech system were not responsive to the needs of African countries. And so there was a discussion to develop these two papers that now govern the way in which we engage in tax discussions as a continent. Over and above that, even within the Africa Union, there are now bodies that are being formulated to discuss the topic of tax and IFFs. And then, of course, as Jason mentioned, when you attend, for example, the Specialized Technical Committee where the Ministers of Finance, Economic Planning and Development are, there's ongoing discussions right now about African financial institutions, right? So I know quite soon we're going to see an African credit rating agency, right? So absolutely, there is regional work that we need to do, regional work that is ongoing on the continent. But, and I think to allude to what you said, there is also work that's going that's going on to strengthen South-South collaboration. So I can tell you now that even as the discussions at the UN are happening to reform the global tax system, there are ongoing discussions that take place that are going on between African countries and those in South America as well. So they recently established what's called the PTLAC, which is a platform for South American countries to talk about tax. And quite frequently, we're starting to see discussions between the Africa Union and PTLAC to think through what kind of tax system works best for us as global South countries as a whole. And then maybe just as I conclude, the establishment of the PTLAC.
Thank you, Shana. We're running short on time, or well, we should have wound out by now. It's 12 noon, but we have I think one of the better sessions and probably of concluding remarks from our panelists about charting the way forward. Maybe we can. There's one question that has come in, I think, kind of interesting, that you can the panelists can in concluding in their concluding remarks to this session can incorporate in their closing remarks. Question is, The question is, let me see, I have it here. Where is it? Oh, wait a second, sorry. The question is, how soon do you think the world will realize a fair and just system that will work for us all? I think, can you complete that in your concluding remarks? I suggest we go the way we presented. So I ask Ms. Jane Nalunga to start, please. Hello. Okay, great.
Thanks, Chennai and Jason, and also the participants. Maybe I will start with that question: how soon the world will realize a fair and just system? For me, I think you can't say whether tomorrow or the other day, because it's really a process and a protracted process. And I think it's important for us to be able to know the journey and to be able to be clear that to be clear about the milestones, and be able to mark where we are getting some successes, because it's not going to be a walkover. It's like everybody has pointed out, Jason and Chennai, it's negotiations, and we are negotiating on so many fronts, too many, and I think that calls also for a lot of coordination, a lot of working together. But I think it's important moving forward to appreciate what we are doing now today, is to appreciate that we need to reform, to transform the global system. And for me, I think it's important as a journey towards realizing that fair and just system. And I want to go back to the issue which Chennai has raised, that even if we have an efficient tax system, for example, or trade system at national level, if we can't tax the multinationals, if our capital account is opened, if there are so many things which are not right in the global system, then we can't work. So that appreciation of the importance of reforming the global system is very, very important. Another issue is the fact that we need to know what we want, that the agenda is structural transformation and how to be able to achieve it. Jason has pointed out the contradictions, that sometimes we know what we want, but we do different things. We want long-term development, but we get short-term loans. I think that's really, really important. And also the coordination, working along different lines, coordinating our tax position to the debt, to finance, to trade. It's also important, but also the levels. Lastly, I want to also raise one very, very important issue, that when you look at the global trading system, it's based on an ideology, a belief, and we need to question that, because the belief today, the ideology, is a private sector, that the private sector can be able to get us out of poverty. It's also based on the market processes. The market is right. Let us leave it to the market. And when you look at all the positions which have been put on table in the current proposals for reforming, those of you have heard about from millions to trillions, the PPPs, public-private partnership, the multicolored bonds, which Jason has pointed out. All these are private-based solutions to the current challenges. And I think we need to question that our states have a role to play, that private sector shouldn't drive our development. So that issue of our ideology is very, very important. And lastly, I think we need also to be aware of the threats. Radu has alluded to this when he asked about the G7, the G20, the OECD. They are interested parties. They are very powerful institutions which are interested in the status quo because they are making money, you know. So we need to be aware of the threats out there and be able to find ways of how to negotiate, to navigate those challenges. Because if we are not aware, we are going to get into bed with the enemy, thinking that we are solving our problems, yet we are perpetuating the system. Lastly, I think we need to work together at national level, regional, global, civil society, government, media. There is a lot of work to do if we are to realize a fair and just global system. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, my colleagues Jason and Chenai, who will continue the struggle, and thanks to the media. Thank you, Paul, for the moderation.
Pass to give concluding remarks on behalf of Siatini, but let me quickly go to Chenai, and if you could speak to, in addition, just you know, the media's, what you see as the media's role in this whole agenda. Thank you.
Yeah.
How it can help.
Sure, Paul. So I think that the media plays such an important role because there is a need for us to highlight, I think, the work that's currently going on. And the reason I say that is because to revert to what I said right at the beginning, we find ourselves at a particular moment that has taken us several decades to get to, where there is a recognition, well, where there's not only a recognition that there's an unfair system, but there is incredible political will and momentum to change it across the various streams, right? Like I mentioned. So, I mean, using the tax example, this particular call, developing countries had been making it for several decades within the UN, but in 2022, suddenly there was a momentum. Suddenly we were able to see a shifting, right? And so I think right now the media can really help in highlighting what's happening, and maybe to draw from what Jane said, help garner the attention and the efforts of the various stakeholders that are affected by all of this, which really is all of us, to continue to support it, right? And the reason I say that is because, like I mentioned, these conversations are not new. Within the tech space, it really dates back to 80, 90 years ago. And if we don't take advantage and capture this moment, there's a chance that we're not going to find another moment like this for at least another 80, 90 years, right? So it's so imperative, it's so important that we really lean into this moment. It's also really important that we lean into this because, and as I mentioned earlier, there is significant pushback and there will continue to be significant pushback. When you are used to a certain amount of privilege, right, particularly in reference to developing countries, equality can feel like oppression, right? Sort of borrowing from a quote that's often made. So we need to recognize that this is going to be a battle. This is going to be a fight. Equality, participation, democratization of these systems is not going to come easy, right? And so because of that, all of us need to come on board. We need all hands on deck. And I think media plays an incredibly big part in helping us get to that position. So I think I know this is closing. So a huge thank you, Paul, for your support in facilitating this process. A huge thank you, Jane, and Siatini for the invitation and for really helping us have what I think is such an incredibly important conversation right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shanae. In an unguarded moment, we caught you yawning on camera, so maybe we're about to release you. It's 4 o'clock in New York. We'll understand that. But yeah, but I think also maybe we should also add that journalists and anyone who can help should inform themselves on the subject. It's a critical subject, which probably, not probably, which the beneficiaries of the status quo are keen not to get much airplay. So if we inform ourselves on the subject, it can find its way into a lot of the reporting we do and help this process of negotiating or building a negotiating position for all these people who are, fighting for an equalization of the global framework. But sorry, Jason, not to take your time. The floor is yours. Your parting comments on this situation.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And I'll try to also attempt a brief response to Luke Anami on how the protests across the continent are linked to the debt situation.
Yes.
So please. I think, look, I think the opportunities are there. I think we've described them quite well. And it's upon us to seize the moments that are put before us. The meeting on the Financing for Development conference that's taking place in Spain, that kicked off in Addis Ababa, is a critical moment. And I would encourage the Fourth Estate to get in touch with us, to have a level of inquiry and interest in how these negotiations are going to take place, because it's just started. And so I think, when you're having your interviews or your breakfast meetings with government officials, it's good to also test the temperature domestically to see if as Chennai mentioned, whether people in New York and capitals are actually talking to each other. And perhaps the Fourth Estate can play that facilitating role of bringing capitals in New York a bit more together in understanding what's going on. Number two, the urgency of what is needed cannot be understated. I think the UN Secretary General has said that the global economic and financial architecture is not fit for purpose. The IMF managing director has said the international system is not fit for purpose. The World Bank president has said the international system is not fit for purpose. Global leaders have said the system is not fit for purpose. So I think it's important that we take that and hold them to account then to the proposals that are being put forward by civil society, by African governments, the Africa Group, and so on. And we advance these kinds of innovative solutions to making Africa a rule maker and not a rule taker, and ensure that these positions are held in these different policy making processes. Failure to do that will perpetuate qualities that we are currently experiencing. Our governments are going to have to take very difficult, unpopular decisions that will lead to popular unrest. And I hope, Luke, this is a response, provides a bit of a response to your question. In Kenya, the government took very unpopular decisions around taxation because it had to continue borrowing to service debt. And it moved that burden to the citizens. And the citizens said enough is enough. In Nigeria, the cost of living has gone up. It's because the Naira has collapsed. They removed a fuel subsidy, which led to an energy crisis. And against civil society advice not to remove that fuel subsidy, they've now had to consider bringing it back. That has not landed well with the new administration in terms of how the public perceive the government looking after its interests. And of course, in Uganda, I think, Kenya being the big brother, and this is me being a little bit politically mischievous, I think as the younger brothers across the lake, they wanted to follow suit and see, how it was going to turn out there in Uganda. But also on a serious note, there is an impending debt problem in Uganda. There's an issue of opulence and mismanagement of funds that we need to talk about. And I think citizens are getting very agitated and fatigued by the level of impunity also. So we need to see how all of that fits to the inequality and the power asymmetries that exist at the international level. And that's why having this press conference helps us to bring that all the way down to the national level. And I want to also, just as I wrap up, echo Chenai's appreciation to Siatini and to you, Paul, for organizing us to have this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jason. That's been great, but I have to pass the mic back to Siatini to make the final remarks on their behalf as the organizers bring us together. But maybe just on my part, I would like to say, of course, thank you to all you guys, Ms. Nalunga, Chenai, and Jason for bringing, shining new light on this very important issue. My first exposure to all these discussions was a book by a lady called Susan George. I think it's still relevant. The book was written in the 80s. It's called How the Other Half Dies. And it kind of brought to light how unfair and unjust the system is. And even that was a discussion in the 80s. You can imagine it's probably, obviously it's matured and developed and evolved since. And it's always a pleasure to learn about all this stuff. But let me pass the mic back to Siatini to conclude and close our press conference for today. Thank you.
I would like to first of all thank the esteemed panelists for the eloquent sharing and elucidating on the various issues that we're discussing today in view of reforming the global financial and economic architecture. But more specifically, I would like to re-echo some of the issues that the panelists already elucidated on, including the role of the media, because the media cannot be ignored. The media is important because journalists shape the agenda. We watch news because of the way journalists play their part in shaping the agenda. They make news worthy of our attention. And in shaping the agenda, we have also, over years, worked with the media on several issues, ranging from illicit financial flows, trade, investment, among others. And we recognize that the media has also been pivotal on these issues. For example, the media was also key in leaking, for example, revealing information pertaining to Paradise Papers, Panama Papers, among others. So those are some of the key wins that we were able to achieve because of the role of the media. So we cannot ignore the role of the media. But more specifically, in view of this conversation, the media is important to first interrogate issues, to go beyond what meets the eye, because most times where we see the role of the media is by quoting without delving deep into comparative analysis of issues. But now what we need, or what we are missing in this discussion, is to connect all these issues, the crisis that we are facing now, to the financial and economic architecture, because the multiple crises we are facing cannot be easily, adequately addressed, especially by African countries, because of the global financial and economic architecture. We need more resources. We can't have more resources because the global financial and economic architecture is not allowing us to have more resources. That's why we are stuck with the climate crisis that we cannot adequately respond to because we don't have resources. And all that is due to the global financial and economic architecture. But also the media is important in opening up the debate and also re-echoing some of the issues that have been coming to the fore. The panelists have alluded to these issues. Africa Development Bank has been making calls. The Secretary General of the UN has also been making calls. Civil society has been making calls. And our participation in the discussions around the UN Framework Convention on Tax are also part of civil society's role in shaping these discussions. And thanks to Ms. Chenai Mukumba for ably representing civil society, Tax Justice Network Africa, in New York as these discussions are taking place, and also amplifying some of the long-standing issues we've been raising. But I would like to also point out that it's also important for the media to collaborate beyond borders, because this virtual presser has brought together media from different countries, but also media working on different issues. So there is need for collaboration, cross-border collaboration among media practitioners in order to make the case for the reform of the global financial and economic architecture, but also more specifically, amplify some of the concerns that civil society is putting on the table and pushing, because Africa is pushing back, but also the global north is pushing. They are resisting the pushback. So there is need for us to put up a spirited fight. And here, the media is critical in shaping the discourse, but also the perceptions and influencing the political agenda and the policy decisions. And the bottom line message from us collectively as Siatini Uganda, as the AFRODAD, Tax Justice Network Africa, Stop the Bleeding campaign is we need a reform of the global financial and economic architecture for us to achieve an inclusive, transparent, and accountable system that works for the global south and especially African countries. Thank you so much to all of you that spared your time to join us. And definitely the discussion cannot stop here. Let's continue to engage online and in other spaces so that we realize the reform of the global financial and economic architecture. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think. All right, thanks. Cheers.
Please make sure you